plant that I'm going to be talking about is a plant that covers many uses. And as I've talked about before, the plants that I really like in first aid are plants that could be used in many different situations. So instead of carrying 5 or 6 different plants, one plant will cover the job in a few places. As I've talked about things like anemone where it just does one thing especially well, I also like those. But the plant that I'm going to talk about now both is useful for insect bites and stings, as an antiviral aid, as an aid for excess phlegm, for high altitude sickness. So it's a plant that covers a lot of range, and that plant is Osha. Some people say Osha, but here I'll be calling it Osha. The genus of Osha is Ligusticum, and then there's a couple of species of Ligusticums. There's one eastern species, Ligusticum canadense. I just started seeing that plant. I haven't used it medicinally. In the West, there's a number of other Ligusticums, but the one I use mainly is the one most commonly called Osha, and that's Ligusticum porteri. The guy's last name was Porter, so porteri. So Ligusticum porteri. The family of Ligusticum is the carrot or celery or parsley family, which is the Apiaceae, as apia as in bee. Sometimes that family is also known as the Umbelliferae, but I'll be referring to it as the Apiaceae. The Apiaceae have a lot of medicinals. It's a huge family. In the northern temperate climates, it's a big family. Have a lot of medicinals. Have some delicious edibles, carrots and parsley, turnips. And also, wait a second, turnips is a Brassicaceae, so I'm sorry, I meant parsnips. And also has some virulent poisons. So poison hemlock and water hemlock are very strong poisonous plants that superficially do resemble Osha. And you just have to learn, like all plants, you have to learn to make accurate identification, especially if you're going to be starting to potentize these things by sticking them in alcohol and giving them to other people. It's one thing to just observe a plant. It's another to start feeding on it and giving it to others. So the plant I'm talking about, Ligusticum porteri, Osha, mainly you find it in Wyoming and in Colorado, those two states. You will find it, some stands of it definitely in New Mexico. And basically it stays at the higher elevation, but Colorado tends to be where I find the largest stands. The parts used are the roots, they're tap roots. And there's some controversy whether or not it should be harvested. It's not very controversial to me because if you travel and you just start going on back roads in the high Rocky Mountains, whether it's in the New Mexico Rocky Mountains or Wyoming or Colorado, you can find huge stands of Osha. And so I do. And it's not the easiest plant to gather. And any place I've ever gathered Osha from, there's lots and lots and lots of it. And when I leave, there's lots and lots and lots of it and some holes in the ground that I've tamped down and tried to make look okay after gathering the Osha. It grows in especially beautiful places. I particularly love high Rocky Mountain meadows where you find Osha and you find beautiful plants like aconite and the geums and monkey flower mimuluses, so beautiful places, elders. So it's the root of the plant that's used. It does work fresh and dried, though I think the fresh root works better. So given the option, I make fresh root tincture out of the plant. Another way to use Osha that I suggest strongly is also making a syrup out of it. To make a syrup out of a medicine, to make a syrup out of a plant, you basically heat the honey, or what you initially do is you take the plant and you put it in honey. So that's going to make a syrup. It's already a syrup. Plant in honey. Now, because honey has a lot of water in it already, the more water in the honey, the existing honey that you buy, the drier your plant has to be. So if you have a honey with a very low water content, you can have a fresher plant with more water. If it's a very watery, runny honey with a lot of water, then your Osha has got to be drier. But the reason for this is because the sugar is stable in the honey at a certain level of water versus sugar, the sugar in the honeys, the different sugars that exist in honeys. And so if you put too much water, so if you put a really fresh, wet plant into a honey, you raise the water percentage, and sometimes it destabilizes and you get bacterial growth. It's just something to know about making any plant honeys. So I bring honey, when I travel to the Rocky Mountains, I bring honeys with me so I can make fresh Osha tincture. Usually I just dry it a little bit, just get some of the exogenous, the water off the outside, a little bit from the inside out, to make the honeys. And then I just soak the Osha in the honey. If it doesn't feel strong enough, one of the things I'll do is make like a triple water bath. So I'll get a double boiler, so a pot with water, another pot that sits in that with more water, and then a jar of the honey with the lid off, and that. And I'll spend hours. So in other words, the water gets hot in the first pot, the water gets hot in the second pot, and it keeps the whole thing miscible and moving around. It just keeps it warm enough where it doesn't degrade the honey and ruin it by adding excess heat, but it allows the honey to be warm enough to move into the pores of the Osha and for a diffusion of the plant's constituents back and forth from the Osha into the honey. The syrup, this honey, is really formidable medicine that I suggest. And it makes Osha for many people much more palatable. So two forms I've talked about now is fresh or dried root tincture. I don't use any other part of Osha, by the way, just the roots. And now fresh or dried root honey or syrup. I just call those honey. You could also just dry it. And so we're going to talk about one of Osha's main uses, and that's as a plant for high altitude sickness. And for that, I just use dry root, and people just chew the dry root. So another medicine is just pieces of dried root. Another way to use Osha is just as a tea. So dried plant in tea for a bunch of different ailments. Osha, the flavor, is very warming and dispersing and aromatic and a little bitter. It has a diversity of flavors to it. Some people like it very much, and some people really can't take, it's just too strong for them. People with more vata constitutions, people just more sensitive to flavor, Osha could be overwhelming. That's why I've talked about making it a honey. It's one way to get it in people who can't stand the strong Osha flavor but can use the medicinal aspects. You can also use it as a spit poultice. Spit poultice, once again, is when you chew a plant and just spit it on. We can talk about how to use Osha for that. But in other words, you can use the plant in alcohol, you can use the plant in honey, you can use the plant in water. It doesn't make a good oil. It's just the aromatics just don't diffuse into the oil very well, or I haven't figured out how to do that well. I want to jump to one of the weirdest ways, so to have an interesting story and have John kind of get a photo angle. You're not going to really see what happened, but show what I once did. So Osha, as I've just said, has a very dispersing quality and also an anti-venomous quality. The reason I'm jumping to this now, besides the fact that I'm never very linear anyway, is that I want to talk about using plants in ways that you hadn't thought about before, and they seem kind of crazy, and since they don't do harm, to try it. So I had a student a long time ago, 1996, and the student lived in Florida, and she got bit by one of the spiders there that created a reaction. She didn't have much of an infection. It was in this part of her foot, but there was a hole there, and it was one of those classic spider bite holes, necrotic tissues that's breaking apart. But it was a year later and still slowly getting worse. I have no idea how that happens, how the amount of venom would continue that way. So we were at the Rainbow Gathering at that point when she showed it to me, and we had just had a lot of time on our hands. Excuse me. We had a lot of time. So first an acupuncturist put needles, made a circle of needles around it to just see if we can stimulate the energy that way. It didn't work, and it just slowly got worse. So what I tried is I took Osha, back to Osha, and I crumbled it up and made an Osha moxa, M-O-X-A. And a moxa, I'm not sure what the technical definition, but a moxa is generally a hairy plant. Osha's not hairy, not the roots, nor the rest of it. Osha, generally a moxa is when you take a hairy plant like a sage, an Artemisia sage, and you roll it up, and then you light it up, and then it brings heat, and then the dispersing quality of the plant there is a moxa. Often you hear about moxibustion or moxa sticks. They're usually an Artemisia, a sagebrush species. So what I tried is I took some Osha, and I ground it. I forgot how I ground it, but I ground it up, and I put it directly on this part of her foot where the wound was, and then I did as you do with these moxas, I lit it, and it took a few tries, but it burnt down. And we did it 2 or 3 times, and you brush it off right before it burns the skin. So basically, a little pyramid of Osha, just like you would have of a moxa, burning it, and it burnt down. And we did it a few times, and it worked. Basically, whatever reason it worked, maybe her foot was so scared that I would continually burn it that I decided to get rid of the venom. But what I really think happened is the qualities of the anti-venom qualities of Osha, plus the dispersing qualities of Osha might have really helped. I haven't tried that many other times. Usually other plants work better. And so that's just one example of using your imagination. And then you have stories to tell on cameras 15 years later. Hopefully you get a couple of other stories along the way. So that's another use of Osha. You can also, if you can make a wash with something, if you can make a tea with something. I've talked about it being water dispersing or, water soluble. It also means you can make soaks out of it. So if you have an Osha, I'd hardly ever do this because I live nowhere near Osha. But if you live near a lot of Osha, you can make a really strong tea and then soak an infected body part. I haven't talked about how to use it except for that spider bite. You can also make a vinegar with it. I tried that. And it smelled very Osha-y, but I've never used it. One more bottle of something waiting to be used in my house. Vinegars, by the way, you also have to worry about fresh plants because vinegar is acetic acid and water, often 14% acetic acid and the rest is water, which means that if too much water added to it, it becomes unstable and can also grow stuff. The last way or the last form of Osha that some people like is as an amulet or a talisman. So I'm not much for the spiritual side of herbal medicine. I accept that it's around, but if you're watching this, you can see I tend to think of things maybe a little more scientifically, not quite reductionistically, but from more of like how does the plant constituents act and how does it work in our physiology, and of course with the Constitution as well, which is not quite as scientifically rigorous. But that said, when you work in first aid situations, one of the things that you're dealing with is just around a lot of disrupted energy. Like people are in pain and people have diarrhea and people don't come to first aid areas generally to hang out. So people come to first aid areas, the majority of them come because they're sick or they're treating sick people. And so if you're a first aid worker, you're like in the most painful part of wherever you can be, right? You're in the part of an event of some kind where the least amount of happiness is being spread. It's where people are puking, it's where people have stomach aches. It's where people got a stick in their eyes, where people, are taking a breather from everything and are very anxious maybe. So it's not the best place for anxious people all the time, but at least there are herbs to be helpful there. The reason I'm saying this is it can be good to have things that bring comfort for you or other people in these situations. So we could just call them comfort items. I would say that pepper jack cheese, well, it's not something I smell and carry in my pocket. It's a comfort food that I might bring just to kind of make me feel better in these situations. Other people, though, might bring, including myself, might bring something that just smells and feels good in your pocket and to your nose. And Osha is a classic talisman to kind of bring strength to people. In other words, it's been used by mostly Native Americans. I guess, it's hard for me to ascertain really where these things are, but it looks pretty clear that as a talisman, sometimes the word fetish is used, as something to alter a situation so the person carrying it or wearing it feels better and is protected. So I don't know how much protection it brings, but I will say that just smelling Osha sometimes for me is like it's a kind of a gentle smelling salt. It kind of breaks up all the tension and all the fear and all the pukey smells accompanying first aid areas. And other people also find it relaxing. So it's just something to consider if you want to wear something and you like wearing fetishes. You can get a nice piece of string or a piece of leather or a guitar string, whatever you want. You just tie it around a piece of Osha and you can wear that if you like to do such things. But I do sometimes carry a piece in my pocket and just occasionally smell it. Just to say another plant that I like for that is cow parsnip seeds. I actually like the smell. They're both related. They're both Apiaceae. But sometimes when I just feel like the tension is tight, I just kind of want a nice smell, I use cow parsnip seeds. I used to carry cow parsnip seeds on airplanes. It's still legal to carry them on airplanes. The problem is when I take it out and crush the bag to smell the cow parsnip seeds, it just makes the whole everybody around me has to smell it, and I don't really want to subject everybody to my love of the smell of cow parsnip seeds. I keep it wrapped up. For those who are wondering, how does he do that without getting the rash? It's just in a muslin cloth bag, and I haven't got a rash doing it that way. So I'm talking, though, about Osha being used as kind of a protection, something feels good to wear when you're working with people. And then you can always use it for medicine. So that's the very beginning of Osha. Now I'm going to start to cover some of its uses. So the first use I want to talk about Osha is for high altitude sickness. Now if you know a little of the physiology or the pathophys with high altitude sickness, different people are differently sensitive to different elevations. Usually we're talking about 8,000 feet, 9,000 feet. Once you get to 10,000 feet, many people will start to feel the effects of being at a high altitude. So let's say the Rocky Mountains, for instance, in the United States. What happens at that level is that you have less oxygen available for you, and that less oxygen means that your body has to start incorporating more red blood cells in your body to grab all available oxygen. People who live at high altitude continually, people live at high mountain ranges, have bodies that already are accustomed to that. You know, their body is able to make more red blood cells or just utilize oxygen differently. For most folks, flatlanders or anybody below 5,000 feet, when you go to a high altitude, a series of health issues can ensue. The most obvious one is just being out of breath and winded all the time. So you drive. These days we drive cars, so you drive. It's easy to get from 6,000 to 7,000 to 8,000 feet. You're at 9,000 feet, and you get out of your car, and initially you might not have an effect, but you're going to notice. Let's say you put a backpack on and you're going hiking, and all of a sudden you are much more tired. Like every step costs you, and it does cost you because you're having a harder time moving oxygen into your cells at this higher altitude. With time, your body will adjust. But initially, you just feel winded and tired and have to stop very frequently to get your breath. So that's one of the symptoms of high altitude. Headaches are very common. You should also be drinking more water. You can have more insensible loss of water. In other words, you're breathing out more water at that altitude as well. So just as a different aside, make sure that you hydrate regularly at a high altitude. Headaches are really common. They come in many forms, frontal lobe or whole head headaches, but usually things are thick and heavy, these kinds of conditions. Another problem at high altitude is insomnia. For many people, they just can't sleep once they get above a certain elevation. And when they do sleep, often just horrible dreams. It's just one of the, I'm not sure why this is, but it's very common in high altitude sickness. There's also much worse altitude sicknesses that I'm not going to cover here. This is your average garden variety high altitude sickness, HAS. So if it's really bad, and the person is really lethargic and really out of it, and often the person's a little bit insensible themselves, they're just having a hard time making decisions, their brains are fuzzy. One thing is just drop down 1,000 feet, go back in your car, spend half hour, and go down and sleep at 7,000 feet, and the next day sleep at 8,000 feet, and the next day go up to 9,000 feet. For some people, that slow acclimation will work really well. And sometimes children really react to high altitude, just crying. Or you can't tell if they're really young, right, what's wrong. Even if they're older, they're not sure what's wrong. Once again, drop down your elevation and come back up. But if it's not that serious, and you're drinking plenty of water, what I would suggest, and we've been doing this at years because a lot of the events I go to are at high elevations, is Osha root. So basically, Ligusticum porteri, which grows at these elevations, one of those kinds of interesting coincidences. And so you gather the Osha, or you have some on you, and you just chew the root. And whatever it does, however it helps oxygenate or gets rid of carbon dioxide, or whatever Osha does, I've just seen it make huge differences with people suffering high altitude sickness, meaning out of breath, maybe headachy, having a hard time sleeping, irritable, having a hard time making decisions, doing much better, quicker, just chewing Osha root. There's a few other plants that might be helpful here, but Osha is the one I primarily use. I don't find the tincture nearly as effective. So at one point I showed my first aid bag, and I didn't have pieces of Osha root in there because I haven't been at a high altitude in a year. But generally, one of the things in my first aid bag is always small pieces of Osha root in case I do end up at a high altitude and I'm treating it. So I hope that makes sense. That's part one of Osha, and that's high altitude sickness. The next thing is sometimes Osha seems to help alleviate the symptoms of histamine-induced allergies. So when I talked about ambrosia species, when I talked about ragweed, I talked about an herb that's sometimes antihistamine-like. I don't know if Osha is antihistamine-like. I don't use it for hives. I don't use it for other symptoms associated with histamine-induced allergies. But if you do have allergies, some people, their allergies get a little more reduced. They have less allergic symptoms using Osha. And the way to use Osha for this is Osha tincture. So it's medium. Osha is not particularly toxic, meaning I don't think it's toxic. I've never seen a toxic reaction. I've seen people not enjoy its flavor. I've seen people even feel a little bit nauseous taking it, but no overt toxicity. And so Osha, Ligusticum porteri, will sometimes help reduce the symptoms. So I'm talking about itchy, watery eyes, and really runny nose, and itchy throat, and coughing and sneezing, and the symptoms often associated with like pollen allergies and grass allergies, sometimes with food allergies, animal allergies, dust allergies, mold allergies. So Osha is helpful for that too. Though I want to say again that my favorite remedy for that is ragweed, ambrosia. My second favorite remedy, because I won't be covering it in Materia Medica, is eyebright, Euphrasia species, which there are some non-native species that grow in the north that I gather. So first, for allergies, first is primarily ragweed, second is Euphrasia, eyebright. And then I'll try Osha as well. There's a few other remedies to try in this lineage of antihistamine-like reducers. So that's it for Osha. So tincture works. You can try tea. Sometimes it just really works. It's certainly worth a try. The next is an old-fashioned term, and that is Osha as an anti-catarrhal. So catarrh, with a bunch of T's and R's and an H, means stuffy in the face. So these days, catarrh is really old-fashioned. So many of us herbalists really enjoy the Victorian kind of romantic language that's often associated with herbal medicine, because a lot of the written stuff about herbal medicine is 1800s. And often it's just, it could be a very expressive, very beautiful way of talking about different illnesses. Catarrh is not the most beautiful word, but it is from that era. And catarrh is basically mucus in the face. It can also be mucus in your lungs. But generally in the old days, when they're talking about an anti-catarrhal, that's what Osha is here, they mean it helps drain the face of mucus, whether it helps by reducing inflammation or just stopping the excessive production of mucus. And Osha is one of those herbs that is helpful in tincture form or tea form to helping reduce excess mucus. It's strong tasting, but it's not just a matter of killing the microbes creating the excess mucus, the catarrh, but also somehow working systematically or systemically to help reduce excess mucus in your faces. So try it as an anti-catarrhal. It's antimicrobial. Osha kills some bacteria. I haven't used, so it kills some so let's try that again. So Osha kills some bacteria. Though in general, I tend to use the berberine-containing herbs more topically, and often I might use Osha internally if there is a bacterial infection. But really, so more than just a broad-based antibacterial like Oregon grapefruit, I would say that Osha's main antimicrobial action, whether it's antiviral in this case, or antibacterial, is the respiratory tract. I would say that Osha's aromatics, it's a strong-smelling plant, and other constituents are very specific for helping respiratory tract infections. I would say it's almost a go-to plant for a variety of respiratory infections. Another go-to plant for respiratory infections is Baptisia, or otherwise known as wild indigo. But Osha is more aromatic, Osha is a little more pushy, and Osha can really help if you have a lot of excessive mucus productions that's counterproductive or unproductive. So I would say if it's not just dust in your face, because Osha is not helpful there, if it's not some other reason that you're really mucusy and you think that you have a respiratory infection, whether viral or bacterial, I would suggest good amounts of Osha. I want to talk about the dosage for Osha in respiratory infections. The average dosage, so by average, I just mean your body is somewhere within the realms of average, not excessively in any direction. If it's excessively thinner, less. If it's excessively heavy, maybe more, depending on your sensitivity to herbs. In that condition, probably something like you start your loading dose, your first dosage, your initial dosage, often you want to go heavier. So if somebody has a respiratory infection, I might give them 1 to 2 dropperfuls of Osha with other herbs like echinacea and maybe Oregon grapefruit and maybe baptisia, just depending. And I haven't said if I would put those all together yet, but if I was just giving Osha for that condition, maybe 1 to 2 dropperfuls every 2 to 4 hours for the first day, and then start reducing both the amounts and the frequency. So pretty large amounts of Osha is what I find useful initially for a respiratory infection. Just make sure it's an infection and not some other problem like a lot of people often outdoors and too much sun makes them very mucousy, and they're going to take a strong dispersing agent like Osha for excess mucus due to overexposure to the sun, actually just make it worse, or it just won't help. In that situation, you need demulcent herbs and water. So that's Osha for respiratory infections and as anti-catarrhal. So one of the ways that I use Osha is for the venomous necrotizing bites of spiders. So the kind of spiders I mean are not black widows. Black widows have a neurotoxin. But for the things that are like brown recluse spiders and hobo spiders and the other spiders people still haven't figured out because often people don't see what spiders bit them. But these necrotizing or cytotoxic spider bites, cytotoxic means cell death, necrotic means it kills tissue. What happens with these spider bites is for some reason, most spider venom just doesn't affect us for whatever reason, but when they bite, the venom is strong enough and it starts to break up all the local tissue. It starts to break up the proteins, starts to go deeper and deeper into us. So that's bad enough, but of course with an injury like that that's deep and doesn't heal fast, you often have an opportunity for secondary bacterial infection. So the point here is Osha can be useful internally as well as externally for the necrotizing spider bites of brown recluse spiders and of hobo spiders. Hobo spiders are more in the northwest. Brown recluses are mostly in the Midwest, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, but they do find them all over the place. So I'm suggesting that if somebody gets bit by a spider, of course, monitor it and make sure it doesn't get very bad if they start to see a spider bite. And at the same time, start giving the person Osha internally, some wet dosage depending on body size and weight and all that. The dosage would be something like 1 to 2 dropperfuls initially every 4 hours, really similar to the respiratory. Then maybe a half a dropperful 3 times a day for a couple of days. But keep it up. You can also put the Osha tincture directly on the spider bite. So Osha has some anti-venom qualities, and really by anti-venom here, I mean those specific kinds of venoms released from these specific kinds of spiders. So very helpful there. I want to say, I'm not sure if I'll get to this later, but a majority of what people think are spider bites are actually staph infections. For years I've wondered this because people would say I have this spider bite, and I look at it, it looks just like a staph infection. And I would say, did you see the spider? Why do you think it's a spider bite? And they'll say, well, I saw a spider some days ago. But then recently I saw a report that, I liked it because it confirmed me. And a lot of people who go to hospitals saying they have spider bites have staph infections. And I'm not sure why they assume it's spider bites, but it's common. So that's important to know for us because you treat staph infections differently than you would treat a spider bite. Expectorants are substances that help you bring mucus out of your lungs and bronchi. So that's what the word expectorant means. You don't always need them. Very often, the person is coughing to bring stuff up, and it's a natural response of the body to try to clear itself. But sometimes the person is just really mucousy, more if they're Cophic types, just heavier and mucousy people in general, like have a lot of excess mucus. And it just seems, unproductive, and they're just constantly spitting up phlegm. Maybe the phlegm is very colored, but it's thick, and there's just copious amounts of it. If it's thin, runny phlegm, Osha might not be the best choice, nor expectorants in general. But thick, heavy phlegm and copious amounts, Osha tea, because of the warming, dispersing qualities of water, with the warming, dispersing qualities and respiratory affinity of Osha, can be helpful. Osha tincture is helpful. You can also, by the way, put the Osha tincture in hot water, so that way you have the dispersing qualities of Osha in the fresh form, the tincture, in hot water. Once again, heat helps dissipate. Heat is just a moving part. You know, if you add heat to things, you just get cells chattering against each other, or you get molecules moving faster. At least you do in the hot water. But heat just seems to break things up very well. So you can also use it as an expectorant in those forms. If you want, you can make Osha honeys and Osha pastilles. You can make Osha pill. I'm forgetting the word for it right now, but when you take Osha and you mix it with a little bit of flour and a little bit of honey, and it's like a cough drop. And you can take those too, but they're pretty strong tasting. Speaking of Osha honey meaning that whole thing I talked about previously with Osha in a honey menstruum. Menstruum is just a fluid anything is in, for coughs, for specific kinds of coughs, for coughs that come from colds and flus. So virally induced coughs or bacterially induced coughs, as opposed to coughs associated with dust or irritation, Osha honey is one of my favorite medicines. It tastes pretty good. I talked about how to make it previously. Your only limit with Osha honey is that it has sugar in it, so if somebody is diabetic or hyperglycemic, too much honey can certainly set them off. But otherwise, Osha honey is just really helpful for a wide variety of coughs associated with colds and flus and maybe bacterial infections as well that are in the respiratory tract. All this is leading up or saying, or is accumulating and saying that Osha is specific for the respiratory organs. It's really just, for whatever reason, the aromatics, the dispersing qualities, the specific chemicals seem to help invigorate lung tissue and move stuff out and kill potential pathogens in there. So big fan of Osha for that. And the last thing about Osha is, it's from personal experience. I used to have a booth at the Grassroots Festival here in Ithaca, New York, which is a big musical festival. And so I was the only herbalist, you know, with lots of potions and lotions. Really what I had is a lot of tinctures and then some individual plants like Osha with me. And they were for sale, but generally I was just treating people. It was always an illicit first aid station. There was a regular first aid station, but if somebody wanted natural medicine first aid, we saw people. We saw lots of people there. It was another way I've got a lot of first aid experience at the Grassroots Festival. But one thing that happens commonly is singers get sore throats, right? The singers do practice and learn how to try not to get sore throats, but of course, singers get sore throats. So they're outdoors and singing loud, and the mic might not be that good. And for a lot of them, they would come by and get 2 plants from me, just pieces of root to chew on to help with singer's throat. One of them was licorice. So licorice is a demulcent. This is not Osha, but licorice is demulcent and soothing. But Osha just seemed to do something to, I don't know, once again, I'm not exactly sure what, but a lot of people would chew small pieces of Osha for their sore throats associated with singing, and their throats felt better and they were able to sing better. I know that it's true because sometimes I would hear in a microphone far away as I was sitting in my booth, some singer saying how much Osha has helped them. So it's another use of Osha is for singer's throat. Sometimes singer's throat is called preacher's throat, meaning just people who talk loud and for long periods of time, perhaps like an herbalist in front of this camera as well. Though I don't have to quite be shouting. John has nicely mic'd me up here, so it's not the same as trying to sing to a large crowd. But Osha could be helpful for that too. So basically, some Osha root to be chewed for singer's throat. This is not really a first aid event in the same way. And then licorice root. Mostly I think I've covered Osha pretty well. It's versatile. Its affinity is for the respiratory organs, the lungs, the bronchi. It's good at breaking up mucus in the lungs. It has an anti-venomous quality for spider bites. It has an anti-allergic quality, meaning that it helps some of the excess mucus and scratchy and itchiness associated with allergies, though it's not my first choice in these things. And also, you can just use it in colds and flus. And you can use it with a lot of other plants. You can use it with golden seal. You can use it with Oregon grapefruit. You can use it with echinacea or baptisia or yarrow. So Osha is a favorite of mine. Every couple of years, I find myself in the Rockies, and I'll gather as much as I can. I make a buttload of tincture and a buttload of honey, and I use it. I mean, I just use up all the Osha I have, and I dry some so I can make more medicine later. So I hope you all have learned a bunch about Osha and learn how to use it and start carrying it with you. And also, that last thing is that high-altitude sickness thing, because that's specific to Osha. Thank you.